I was driving home from a late-night party, taking the long way home to clear my head. It was a dark and winding road, with no street lights and dense forest on either side. As I drove, I heard a strange noise coming from under my car. It sounded like a low growl, but I brushed it off as just my imagination. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, swerving to avoid hitting it. When I looked closer, I realized it was a man, dressed in tattered clothing and covered in dirt. He stumbled over to my car, his face twisted in pain. He begged me to take him to the hospital, saying he had been attacked by a wild animal. I hesitated for a moment, but then I opened the door and let him in. As we drove, the man's behavior became increasingly erratic. He kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering to himself incoherently. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. Suddenly, he lunged at me, his eyes blazing with madness. I swerved off the road, my car crashing into a tree. When I came to, the man was nowhere to be found. I stumbled out of my car and looked around. I could hear the man's laughter echoing through the forest. It was a sound that chilled me to the bone. I managed to make it back to civilization, but I was never the same again. The experience had left me shaken and afraid. I still hear the man's laughter in my nightmares, a constant reminder of the danger that lurks in the darkness. I was on a road trip through the middle of nowhere, with nothing but miles of empty highway ahead of me. As the sun began to set, I realized I needed to find a place to spend the night. That's when I saw a sign for a motel up ahead. I pulled into the parking lot, which was empty except for one car. I walked into the lobby and was greeted by an old woman behind the desk. She had a kind smile, but her eyes were cold and distant. I got my room key and headed down the dark hallway to my room. The place was old and run down, with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. But I was too tired to care. As I lay in bed, I heard strange noises coming from the room next door. It sounded like someone was moving furniture around. I tried to ignore it and go to sleep, but the noise only got louder. Finally, I got up and knocked on the door. There was no answer. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open and was hit with a blast of cold air. The room was empty except for a single chair in the middle of the room. The windows were all boarded up, and there was a strange symbol drawn on the wall in what looked like blood. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw the old woman from the front desk standing in the doorway. She was holding a large kitchen knife. "Get out of here," she hissed. "This place is cursed." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran out of the room and didn't stop until I was back in my car. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the old woman standing in the parking lot, staring at me with her cold, distant eyes. I never stopped at a roadside motel again. I was backpacking alone through the remote wilderness, seeking solitude and adventure. The crisp autumn air was refreshing, and the vibrant colors of the leaves were breathtaking. I felt at peace, alone with nature and my thoughts. As the sun began to set, I set up camp in a secluded clearing. I built a fire and cooked my dinner, listening to the sounds of the forest. That's when I heard it, a low growl, followed by a rustling in the bushes. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I was in the territory of bears and wolves, but I hadn't expected them to come so close to my campsite. I grabbed my knife and sat, waiting for the creature to reveal itself. But it wasn't a bear or a wolf that emerged from the bushes. It was a man, tall and muscular with a wild look in his eyes. He was wearing dirty clothes and had a long beard that hung down to his chest. I was afraid, but I tried to remain calm. I asked him what he was doing there, but he didn't answer. Instead, he walked closer to my campsite, his eyes locked on me. I stood up, holding my knife tightly. But the man was unfazed. He continued to advance, until he was standing right in front of me. I was terrified, but I didn't want to show it. I stood my ground, ready to defend myself. But then the man spoke. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to scare you. I'm just lost." I looked at him, confused. Lost? In the middle of the wilderness? But then I saw the desperation in his eyes, and I knew he was telling the truth. I lowered my knife, and we talked for a while. He told me his story, of how he had been hiking with a group but had gotten separated from them. He had been wandering alone for days, without food or water. I gave him some of my supplies and showed him how to navigate with a compass. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I slept fitfully that night, with one eye open and my knife by my side. But in the morning, when I packed up my campsite and continued on my journey, I felt a sense of relief. I had encountered a scary situation, but I had lived to tell the tale. And maybe, just maybe, I had helped someone in need. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving alone on a deserted road. The rain was pouring down in sheets, and my windshield wipers were struggling to keep up. I was miles away from civilization, and my phone had no service. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes, barely avoiding hitting them. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman, soaking wet and shivering. "Please, help me," she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "My car broke down, and I don't have a phone. Can you give me a ride?" I hesitated for a moment, knowing it was risky to pick up a stranger in the middle of the night. But I couldn't leave her out there in the storm. I unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in, grateful for the warmth of my car. As we drove, she told me her name was Emily and that she was on her way to visit her sick mother. I felt a pang of sympathy for her and was glad I could help. But then things started to feel off. Emily was fidgeting in her seat and wouldn't stop staring at me. Her eyes seemed to change color, and her voice became eerily calm. "I'm so grateful for your help," she said. "You're a kind person. But I have to tell you, I'm not what I seem." My heart was pounding, and I didn't know what to do. Was she going to harm me? "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm a ghost," she said matter-of-factly. "I died on this road many years ago, and I've been trying to find my way back ever since." I felt a chill run down my spine. Was she telling the truth? Before I could say anything else, she disappeared right in front of my eyes. I slammed on the brakes and looked around, but she was nowhere to be seen. I never did figure out what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure: I never want to drive alone on a deserted road again. I was house sitting for a friend who lived in the middle of nowhere. It was a beautiful house, but the isolation made me feel uneasy. I tried to shake off the feeling and enjoy my weekend alone. On my first night there, I heard a strange noise outside. It sounded like someone was walking around the house. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the sound persisted. I peeked out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The next night, the sound returned. This time, it was accompanied by a tapping on the windows. I was too scared to investigate, so I locked myself in the bedroom and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard the tapping again. On the third night, I decided to confront whatever was outside. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way around the house. As I rounded the corner, I saw a figure standing in the distance. It was a woman, dressed in white, with long dark hair. She didn't move or make a sound. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. I walked closer, and that's when I realized something was off. Her skin was gray, and her eyes were black. She had no expression on her face. I ran back to the house, locking all the doors and windows. I could hear the woman outside, scratching at the door and windows, trying to get in. I knew I had to do something, so I called the police. When the police arrived, they searched the property but found nothing. I told them about the woman I had seen, but they brushed it off as my imagination. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the living room, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I left the house and never went back. But the memory of that woman still haunts me to this day. I don't know who or what she was, but I'm just glad I made it out alive. I was on a road trip with my best friend, driving through the mountains on a winding, deserted road. We were deep in the wilderness, with no cell phone signal and no other cars in sight. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning a deep shade of red. As we rounded a bend, we saw something that made our blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure dressed in a tattered cloak. Its face was obscured by shadows, but we could see its glowing red eyes staring straight at us. My friend slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. We hit the figure with a sickening thud, and the car lurched to a stop. We both sat there, frozen with fear, as we watched the figure slowly stand up and start walking towards us. We tried to start the car, but it wouldn't turn over. We were trapped, with no way to escape. The figure was getting closer, and we could hear its ragged breathing. Suddenly, it stopped and tilted its head to one side, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Then, it turned around and walked back into the darkness. We were both shaking with fear, but we knew we had to get out of there. We managed to start the car and drove away as fast as we could. We didn't speak for a long time, both lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we got to the next town that we finally talked about what had happened. We both saw the same thing, and we both knew it wasn't just our imagination. To this day, we still don't know what that figure was or what it wanted. But we do know that we were lucky to make it out alive. It was a warm summer evening, and I decided to take a walk through the park. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees and the pond. I was lost in thought, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment when I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss. Do you have the time?" I turned around to see a man standing a few feet away from me. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and piercing blue eyes. I noticed he was wearing a long black coat, despite the warm weather. I checked my watch and told him the time. He nodded and thanked me, and I turned back to continue my walk. But as I walked away, I could feel his eyes on me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him watching me intently. I picked up my pace, feeling uneasy. But the faster I walked, the closer he got. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting louder and louder. I broke into a run, but he kept pace with me. As I ran, I saw a police car in the distance. I made a beeline for it, hoping to find some safety there. I pounded on the door, and the officer inside rolled down the window. "Please help me," I gasped. "There's a man chasing me." The officer stepped out of the car and confronted the man. He was able to detain him, and I gave my statement to the police. It turned out that the man had a history of stalking and assault. I was lucky to have escaped unharmed, but the experience left me shaken. I never walked through that park alone again. I was driving home from a late shift at work when I saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road. It was dark and I felt uneasy, but something about him made me pull over and offer him a ride. He climbed into the back seat and I began driving down the deserted highway. We made small talk for a few minutes until I noticed his behavior was strange. He kept fidgeting and mumbling under his breath. I tried to ignore it, but my nerves were on edge. I decided to take a shortcut through a back road to avoid the traffic on the main highway. As we turned onto the back road, the hitchhiker suddenly lunged forward and grabbed my shoulder. He whispered, "Turn around now or you'll regret it." I was terrified and my heart was pounding, but I managed to keep my cool. I told him calmly that I was going to keep driving and that he needed to relax. But the hitchhiker was relentless, and he kept grabbing at me and screaming that we were going to die. I was about to lose control when we came across a police checkpoint. I pulled up and frantically explained the situation to the officer. He instructed me to pull over to the side of the road and he approached the hitchhiker in the back seat. After a brief conversation, the officer came back to my car and asked me to step out. He told me that the hitchhiker was wanted for murder and that he had been on the run for weeks. The officer said that if I had continued down that road, I probably wouldn't have made it out alive. I shuddered at the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't taken that shortcut. The hitchhiker was arrested, and I made it home safely. But I will never forget that night and the realization that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. It was a warm summer night, and I had just finished hanging out with my friends. As I walked home alone, I felt a strange sensation of being watched. I turned around, but there was no one there. Brushing off my unease, I continued walking. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps kept getting closer. I turned around, ready to confront whoever was following me, but there was no one there. As I walked, the footsteps continued to follow me. I started to run, but the footsteps kept pace with me. My heart pounding in my chest, I finally made it to my apartment building and ran inside, slamming the door shut behind me. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept my doors locked at all times, and I always looked over my shoulder. But nothing happened, and I started to think I had just imagined it all. That is until one night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my window. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a tree branch, but the scratching got louder and more persistent. I finally got up and walked over to the window, expecting to see a raccoon or a stray cat. But instead, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I screamed and backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the shadowy figure of a man outside my window, grinning at me with a sinister smile. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area, but they found no trace of him. For months afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I never saw the man again. Now, years later, I still shudder at the memory of that night. I'll never forget the way those glowing eyes looked at me, or the way that man grinned at me through the window. But I lived to tell the tale, and I know now to always trust my instincts and stay safe. I was driving home from a late night shift when I saw something strange in my rearview mirror. It was a car with no headlights, tailgating me dangerously close. I couldn't make out the driver's face, but I knew something was off. As I pulled into my driveway, the car behind me turned in as well. I quickly got out of my car and tried to get inside, but the front door was locked. I could hear the car engine running, and I knew I was in trouble. I turned around, and that's when I saw the driver for the first time. It was a man, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, his face obscured in shadow. He got out of the car and started walking towards me, his steps slow and deliberate. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew I had to do something. I backed away slowly, reaching for my phone. But just as I was about to call the police, the man lunged at me. We struggled on the ground, and I felt his hands around my neck. I fought back with all my strength, hitting him with everything I had. But the man was strong, and he seemed determined to kill me. In a moment of desperation, I reached for the car keys in my pocket and hit the panic button. The sound of the car alarm blaring seemed to startle the man, and he loosened his grip. I managed to get back on my feet and run towards the house. As I fumbled with the keys, I could hear the man behind me, his footsteps getting closer. But I finally got the door open and slammed it shut behind me. I called the police, and they arrived quickly. They found the man still in my driveway, and he was arrested on the spot. It turned out he was a wanted criminal who had been on the run for weeks. I was shaken by the experience, but I survived. It taught me to always trust my instincts and be prepared for the unexpected.